Okay. Hello, YouTube. Again, it's been a while. I've defended since the last time I was live on this platform. Defended my dissertation. My name's Ian McLaughlin, and I am still technically a PhD candidate, but not for long, at the University of Pennsylvania, and I study addiction and anxiety, and specifically the neurophysiology of anxiety through the lens of addiction. I planned on having something prepared to sort of begin with. There's a bunch of interesting studies that have come out recently. One having to do with like touch sensitivity that's typically associated with autism spectrum disorder. Another regarding a discovery of how chronic stress affects basically neural stem cells in the hippocampus. And then how cable news may or may not sculpt political views of people who consume it. I suppose I should see if this is actually live. Yeah, okay. And then there's a study on what has been termed cute aggression. If you've ever felt that like sensation of like, oh my gosh, it's so cute, I can't even stand it. Like when you see a little puppy or a kitten or something, or a baby, human baby of any kind of animal, actually, is what the study found. But I was unable to sort of prepare it as much as I'd like to, so maybe I'll be able to talk about that in the future. Turns out having a baby, 7-month-old, when your wife is out of town, consumes all of your time, including sleep time. So we can talk about it if it comes up. Otherwise, maybe I'll talk about it later. So I'm just going to straight up go live. So here we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I am a PhD candidate for now in neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania, and I study the neurophysiology, or the brain cells that are involved in anxiety, specifically through the lens of addiction, drug addiction, including nicotine, alcohol, opioids, and so on. My wife went out of town at the beginning of this weekend, and I learned how much time it takes. Well, this is actually the second time my wife's been out of town, and this time it wasn't actually so bad, but it's tough to not have the maternal figure present, particularly at around 6 p.m., which is when my baby begins to pine for her mother. Anyways, there have been like a bunch of interesting studies that have come out recently. One that has to do with mapping out the biology of touch sensitivity that's associated with autism spectrum disorder, and specifically light touch. So not just sort of like touching like you would bump into somebody, but rather like sort of subtle touching, which can be fairly aggravating to folks on the spectrum. And then there was the effects of chronic stress on the brain, specifically on rates of neurogenesis in the adult hippocampus. And then there was the neuroscience of cute aggression, which is sort of like if you've ever experienced, like when you look at a puppy or a kitten or a baby human or a baby animal of any kind, is what the study actually found, where you're like, it's so cute, I can't even stand it, I just want to like crush it, I just want to hug it, I love it so much. You know, they did a little study on that. There's an interesting essay by a psychiatrist in London about whether or not humans actually evolved to really be happy, as we sort of commonly conceive of it today. And there was more. I mean, you know, exercise. Another study evaluating the effects of exercise on folks who are at risk of Alzheimer's disease, which is fascinating, perhaps unsurprising, but it actually is surprising if you're sort of steeped in the literature of exercise and dementia. So we can talk about all those things, or we can talk about whatever comes up to your mind. Hey, what's up, Mew app? Good to see you. Hope all is well on your side of the globe. What is your professional goal? I am currently evaluating those goals. It really depends on really what opportunities are available. Academia is extremely competitive, and there are a couple labs that I'd love to work in which I'd love to work. But it really depends upon how much funding they have at the moment that I might work with them. Alternatively, I've always been interested in writing, and there's a lot to be written about about the sort of state of drug addiction in the United States and what we are and more importantly are not doing at a sort of regulatory level, at a social level, and that is something that I'd love to do some work towards, and I just haven't had very much time to be able to write something substantive enough that I could, pitch it to online online outlets. So that's something that I'm seriously considering as I'm completing the finishing touches on my dissertation. Bonjour. We could talk about Neuralink. I'm happy to. Are you money motivated? Not really. Generally speaking, people don't go into academia in biomedical science, generally speaking, to make a lot of money. You can. I mean, that is an opportunity that's available if you go into the private sector, meaning if you go to work for like a biotech company or a pharmaceutical company or any sort of version of any species of that kind of industry, you can make a really comfortable income. However, you are a bit more expendable, meaning that if one of those companies encounters a time where their profits are not as substantial, generally speaking, it is research that they will tend to lay off. Now, of course, you've made some comfortable money, so you can tolerate that. But it is a different kind of work. It's not better or worse, but it's not as creatively driven necessarily. A lot of that is mythology, but you don't have as much agency over what you do day to day in that world, and it's just not something that's ever really thoroughly interested me. It is something that I've had some experience in. I've been lucky to at the University of Pennsylvania. There have been opportunities to get some experience doing, but I am more interested in some version of this, of talking about the things that got me excited about science in the first place, about neuroscience in the first place, and in particular, what is eminently fascinating, or I think important to me, is, again, what we are and are not doing about the addiction crisis in the United States. I mean, we talk about a lot of crises in the United States, and there are a lot of crises in the United States, but one of them that we only really give lip service to is the addiction, overdose, and fatality epidemic in the United States. I mean, the numbers of people who are dying year over year, we've never seen in the history of any country. And Philadelphia, cities like Philadelphia are being hit quite hard, but Philly isn't the only city. I mean, much of the Northeast is being hit, and it's coming soon to a town near you. And there are no signs. I mean, I think this past year we went down from over 70,000 people, unprecedented number of people, down to like just under 69,000. So progress, right? No, that is unacceptable. And we have really not changed anything, certainly at a federal level, at the most powerful level. And there are some interesting experiments going on at the sort of local and state level. But even those experiments, I would submit to you, are Band-Aids. And we need a Manhattan Project style response to this issue. And it shows no, prejudice regarding certain populations that are most vulnerable to it. It doesn't matter. And so that is something that I would really like to be able to work on, at least for a short period of time, in just sort of doing my best to inject some new memes into the discourse. But in the immediate future, I am concerned with finishing the revisions on my dissertation, which I'm going to do probably in the next week, finishing up some experiments that I've been meaning to do since I started my PhD, which I'm working on right now. They're very, very high-risk experiments, but they're the kind of thing where, like, when I was in college, this all was like, it sounded like wizardry, and now we can do it. And my PI has the resources and the personality to enable me to do that. So that's what I'm doing in the beginning, or in the near future. Hi, where are you? I am in beautiful, sunny Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the best city on earth. Okay, can you talk about the article "Evolve to be Happy"? Oh, I would love to. Okay, so I mentioned this in the very beginning if you missed it, but there was it wasn't a research article. It was an article written by a very experienced psychiatrist from London that was sort of, one way to put it might be like diagnosing one of the issues about how we think about happiness. It's an interesting thing. He sort of highlights it as being part of the pathology, as being sort of a quintessentially American export. And in fact, it is one of the inalienable rights in the United States, the pursuit of happiness. And now, I think that is sort of just a cute thing that he highlighted. I don't think that that's particularly meaningful. But what he did highlight, which I've agreed with since I started my PhD, is that there is this whole industry that caters towards people who are vexed by a lack of happiness, a lack of sort of just positivity in their lives, and there are a couple different dimensions of this that you can evaluate. One is, how do we define happiness? And if you step back from your day-to-day life and put it in an evolutionary context, we are not, and you look at it neurobiologically too, it is unsustainable. An emotional state like happiness, like the greatest happiness that you can experience. Like, for example, I highlighted on Twitter earlier, yesterday, my daughter started holding her own bottle. She's 7 months old, holding her own bottle while eating. And it's a very, mundane kind of thing, but it is a developmental leap. And I was just watching this and I was just amazed and I was extremely happy. And that feeling is unsustainable neurobiologically, right? It's part of why drugs like heroin or cocaine or any alcohol are addictive for a lot of folks. Not for everybody, but for a lot of folks, because they artificially induce that feeling of happiness. But neurobiologically, what happens once you're in that state is you attain homeostasis. You go back to baseline. And there's a reason for that evolutionarily. Imagine a species of human, or of homo, let's say of hominid, or a tribe of humans that was just always in that state of contentedness, of happiness, and compare that to a tribe of humans who experienced happiness only when something really beneficial happened, only when a new baby was born, or a hunt was successful, right? But then after that, they reattained baseline and they weren't happy, they weren't necessarily sad, but they were sort of neutral. If you think about what motivates us to do pretty much anything, it is the pursuit of those positive emotional states. It is the rudder of behavior. It is why we have emotion in the first place. And so the notion that we all ought to be seeking just constant happiness, and we might distinguish that from satisfaction or contentedness, right? But happiness is a sort of misunderstanding of what that emotional state really is supposed to be. It is supposed to be the acute reward, the acute that feeling of gratification that something just went right for me. And now on to the next thing, because it is extraordinarily rare that just one of those moments leads to optimal survival, leads to reproduction. Of course, the sort of foundation of evolution is reproduction, propagating the species, propagating your genes. And so if you are just always happy, what is your motivation to engage in any of the kind of unpleasant work that would sustain survival, sustain reproduction, right? And I think it was the beginning of the article. So I should say the psychiatrist's name is Rafael Yuba. I believe he's from Spain, but he's worked in London for a very long time at the London Psychiatry Center. And I think the beginning of the article was a little bit of a clickbaity thing, but hey, we live in the era of clickbait, right? But I think the evolutionary biology context into which he frames it is exactly how I've thought about it, and I think is very defensible, let's say. Okay, we can talk about Neuralink. I've talked about Neuralink now for the past 2 streams. I'm happy to continue talking about it. There's a lot to talk about, but maybe like something a little bit more specific of a topic. Okay. How many in your lab takes metformin, rapalogs, or central stimulants? Okay. So Monkey Horse is bringing up the purported wonder drug metformin. I should say I have a podcast. It's called Wired to be Weird, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher and where all fine podcasts are found. And the last episode that I did was about longevity. And some of you might be familiar with metformin, particularly if you were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Metformin is remarkably effective at helping to treat diabetes. It is a very old drug, actually. It's derived from the French lilac, interestingly, which, by the way, used to be used centuries ago for people who had excessive urination issues. And if you have type 2 diabetes, perhaps before you attain treatment, you might know that excessive urination is a hallmark symptom of diabetes. So they were onto something back then, but then we then discovered the active ingredient that was actually accomplishing this therapeutic effect. Anyways, so metformin, effective for type 2 diabetes, but there have been all these interesting studies that have correlated it with, like in folks with type 2 diabetes, or diabetes mellitus, folks who are treated with metformin and they have type 2 diabetes will tend to live longer and exhibit better cardiovascular health than folks with type 2 diabetes who are not treated with metformin, maybe treated with something else. And in some cases, some studies have shown that they actually exhibit health benefits compared to just people without type 2 diabetes, which is remarkable, right? Type 2 diabetes is certainly not adaptive, but for many years now, there has been this interest in metformin, and preclinical or in animal experiments, it has been shown that metformin can increase lifespans dramatically. And so there is this interest, and there are clinical trials that are going on right now to evaluate the longevity effects of metformin in people who are otherwise healthy, which hasn't really been done in earnest at a broad clinical trial level. And so we shall see. I talked about metformin a lot more in the podcast. So again, the podcast is called Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher. It's the episode about longevity. Now, okay. So rapalogs, we talked a little bit about like rapamycin, which is, I assume our friend here, Monkey Horse, is bringing up metformin and rapalogs for much the same reason, both longevity-related effects. I talked a little bit about rapamycin in that podcast episode, but we talked more about some of the other things that are a little bit more popular in the general public, which is nicotinamide riboside, nicotinamide mononucleotide. These are supplements that are now increasingly hard to get because they're so popular. Like just buying it on Amazon is tough to get. And there have been some interesting preclinical studies showing an interesting effect on longevity of NMN or nicotinamide mononucleotide or nicotinamide riboside, and then central stimulants. Now, so central stimulants, I mean, that is a giant class of drugs. Probably when people see the word or the phrase central stimulants, they probably think of drugs like amphetamine or maybe even cocaine. Those are central stimulants, but there is one of the most commonly consumed drugs in the entire world that is a central nervous system stimulant, caffeine. And I would challenge pretty much anybody to find a lab, a biomedical lab at least, probably pretty much any lab, where there isn't a constant availability of some caffeine source. In some labs in which I worked before I joined my lab, although my lab, this is true for my lab too, there was just free coffee available at all times via a Keurig or something like that, provided by the principal investigator or the boss, right? The person who runs the lab, out of their own pocket, not out of grant funding, I should say. And so, yeah, pretty much everybody. I don't think anybody in my lab doesn't consume caffeine. My PI is from Italy, so she consumes very potent forms, caffeine delivery systems. I consume caffeine, but I generally rely on, it's not coffee or tea. It's sort of like a mixture of branched chain amino acids and just caffeine. It's very simple. It tastes a little bit, the taste is kind of strong, but it's very effective. And at least you're getting some branched chain amino acids in addition to that. Opioids, we can talk about opioids, but there's a lot to talk about there. Here's something that I think is worth paying attention to when it comes to opioids. And again, there's so much more we could talk about. If there's a specific topic, please feel free to bring it up. Right now, fentanyl, which is a hyperpotent opioid traditionally reserved specifically for the treatment of terminal cancer pain, so pain that is so severe in folks who don't have much longer, that the potential addictive side effects of fentanyl are outweighed by the increased quality of life that they experience when given fentanyl. It's also used in very invasive surgeries. In some cases, it's used in an epidural when a woman is giving birth. And it is also responsible, almost single-handedly, for this gigantic uptick in opioid overdose fatalities because it is so potent. So just to give you a concept of how potent fentanyl is, I don't really have an opioid tolerance. I don't consume them regularly, but if somebody were interested in trying to take me out using opioids, for morphine, they'd have to, if you were to look at like just the powder, like the physical amount that it would take to cause me to overdose and die, the amount of morphine would be quite significant. It would be like a pile of powdered morphine. Hydrocodone, that pile would be smaller, but it would still be visible. You'd see like, maybe it would look like a pile of sugar in my hand. For oxycodone, which is more potent still than hydrocodone, it would be still less than hydrocodone, but you'd still be able to see it. In fact, it would be maybe a couple of tablets that somebody would have to give me. When it comes to fentanyl, it would be smaller than a grain of rice. It would be so small that you almost might not even be able to see it in my hand from this distance. Now, fentanyl used to only really be available again, for very severe or very invasive surgeries, or in patches, transdermal patches. So you couldn't really get like powdered fentanyl, but now you can. Now it's pretty easy to get on gray market or black market sources from chemistry labs internationally. Most of it comes over the mail. It does not come via any of the borders that are attached to the United States. It's because it's so difficult to identify in a system like the mail. Now, here's the point I wanted to get to. Fentanyl is a very significant public health challenge right now, but it is not the most potent opioid that is used clinically today, nor that is being trafficked on gray market and black market retailers. Today, you can get much more potent opioids than fentanyl. And fentanyl, part of the reason for why fentanyl is such a challenge right now is that it's frequently used in street samples of heroin, where there's so little heroin now in the actual sample that they need to up the potency somehow. And hey, fentanyl is really good for that. But now you can get, for example, carfentanil, or the recently approved for wider use sufentanil, which is even more potent than carfentanil, or I should say even more potent than fentanyl. And so if one is of the opinion that, okay, this is a serious problem and I want a solution, maybe we should just outlaw fentanyl. The next day, there will be an even more potent alternative to fentanyl that is available, easily available. And by the way, there are even more potent versions of opioids that you've never heard of that only go by letters and numbers. So the idea that we're going to be able to apply the same drug laws that we've used for methamphetamine or for cocaine and crack, or historically for cannabis or weed, is just completely underestimating how challenging this is going to be compared to those drugs. So that's why I think that this is such a serious issue, and we're not having a nearly competent enough conversation about it. All right, give people their weed and they'll be fine. Stats show it. So I know what you're talking about. Mitchell's either Mitchell Sand or Mitchell's and. There was some preliminary evidence that in states that had legalized recreational use of cannabis, the broad statistics of opioid consumption indicated a decline. In other words, where people could just go buy weed legally from stores, they tended to consume less opioids. More recent stats, however, suggest that might not be the case. And we've known for a while that in some cases you can use cannabis to help either attenuate the amount of opioids needed to treat something like chronic pain, an injury-related pain. But in some cases, it actually made it worse for some people. Cannabis is a very complicated drug. I'm happy to talk about its pharmacology, but it's not as straightforward as an opioid. It binds one of the most complicated receptor signaling systems in the human body. And there's a lot of genetic variability in terms of how people react to cannabis. Some people find it nearly hallucinogenic, and some people just find it very sedating. And I know some who have experience with cannabis might say, yeah, that has everything to do with the strain. Even if you control for variability in levels of THC concentrations versus CBD or cannabidiol, even that doesn't account for just how variable your mileage may vary, right? Just how variable you may react to it versus somebody else. So I think it is a mistake to conceive of cannabis as being a cure-all for this issue. Just to give you more context on where I'm coming from, I think cannabis should just be legalized recreationally. So, but what I'm saying is that I don't think we should make that argument contingent upon its activity as a panacea, its ability to cure all of society's ills. It's just not. It's just a drug, right? It's a unique drug, but it's not going to cure all the things that a lot of advocates claim. And when they do that, I think they put themselves in a very weak position, because when people who have training in pharmacology or have experience with cannabis and they're not just gung-ho about the activism, they look at those claims and they're like, this is absurd. This is patently false. And that gives the prohibitionists all the ammunition that they need to say all of these arguments are wrong, are fallacious. I like to talk about that just because we're in an era where there's this wave of cannabis legalization, which I think is a positive thing, but we should be even-handed about this. We should be realistic, pragmatic about it. It's not for everybody, and we can talk more about that if you'd like. Okay, how do you know if your brain has inflammation? Kenneth Frederick. Yeah, interesting topic. So inflammation is a very broad term, right? It refers to inflammatory signaling, right? And this is signaling, biological signaling, right? Molecules or proteins interacting with each other to cause some kind of biological event. Generally speaking, it's associated with the immune system. And so, for example, when you have an injury, stepping back from like classically, immune-related signaling, when you get a bruise, that's inflammation, right? There's a damage signal that has been induced by the physical damage to your skin and the muscle tissue potentially, and that induces inflammatory signaling, which causes the inflammation that you then see. But then also when you get infected with the influenza virus or the rhinovirus, a cold or whatever, some kind of virus or bacterium, you're also experiencing inflammation. And part of the reason for why the flu is oftentimes associated with that achiness that you don't really get with a cold, that is inflammatory signaling. Now, you can push it further. Inflammation is still thought by a lot of like dementia researchers, Parkinson's researchers, migraine researchers. Inflammation is thought to be associated with a lot of the pathology that arises from all of those conditions, where it's not actually the accumulation of amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles in Alzheimer's disease is not necessarily the most proximal cause, the most direct cause of the dementia, of all the symptoms that people suffer when they're developing a dementia like Alzheimer's disease. Rather, it is the inflammatory signaling that results from those accumulations, from those aggregates, that then causes a bunch of damage in the brain. And that is actually what's causing the dementia, not the accumulations. That is not necessarily accepted wisdom. That's not necessarily, a consensus, but it is definitely an ongoing means of attack for treatment. Now, how would you know if there's any inflammation in your brain? So first of all, unless there is some very significant injury, like for example, a traumatic brain injury, you wouldn't necessarily know. Peripherally, the way you know that you have inflammation is you get a bruise or you feel pain. Whenever you have an injury, part of the reason that you have an injury is due to the inflammatory signaling induced by the injury, by the joint pain, for example. When you have irritable bowel syndrome or Crohn's disease, a lot of the discomfort is due to the inflammation induced by those conditions. In the brain, we don't have the ability to feel pain derived from damage in the brain. We don't have pain receptors in the brain. And so the only outward manifestation of, let's say, again, we're not talking about traumatic brain injuries where, something very significant just happened. We're talking about that kind of inflammation that's associated with potentially stress, with a lack of sleep, with dementia and all the things that I named earlier. The only outward manifestation would be a change in your disposition, a change in, your mood levels or your ability to remember things or, those types of things. And so you wouldn't necessarily know is what I'm saying. There's no indicator, there's no bruise, there's no obvious sign that there's inflammation going on. But I wouldn't, if I were in the shoes of somebody who's concerned that there might be some inflammation going on in my brain, I wouldn't be like, how do I find the inflammation? I'd be like, am I more tired than I normally am? Is my memory more deficient than it normally is? And those symptoms would then be used in a clinical setting, like, okay, you have these symptoms, now let's evaluate to see if there's any kind of lesions in your brain. All right, without funding from the Sackler family. Yeah, but it does kind of seem like the Sackler family may no longer be in such a vaunted position, given all the lawsuits that they're now dealing with due to at least some of the family's association with Purdue Pharma. For anybody that's not familiar, the Sackler family is an extraordinarily wealthy family. The earlier members of the family founded Purdue Pharma, which makes a bunch of different very successful medications, one of which being oxycodone. And they are now contending, they're confronting lawsuits from a bunch of different states due to their implication in the opioid overdose epidemic. It's my pleasure. Thank you for joining, Michelle. Is there real proof of CBD benefits? Has to be a huge dosage. Yeah, so Rebel Dog Duke. So CBD, for anybody that's not familiar, is cannabidiol. And that is the sort of lesser studied, but now very intensely intriguing, other cannabinoid, that is notably pharmacologically active in cannabis, as opposed to tetrahydrocannabinol or THC. THC is thought to be responsible for the vast majority of the psychoactive properties of cannabis, whereas CBD is it has interesting effects on the pharmacology of THC in the central nervous system. It seems to attenuate some of the more hallucinogenic properties of THC. But regardless, it's thought to have most of its activity peripherally outside of the central nervous system. And so is there any evidence that CBD has benefits? Yes, there is some evidence that CBD is beneficial, for example, for the treatment of treatment-resistant epilepsy. There are some folks who have seizures for whom no standard medication is working, but CBD, for one reason or another, it mitigates the frequency and the severity of their seizures. So that in and of itself is meaningful and important evidence. But then there's also some evidence of people who suffer from chronic pain that it helps them, it improves their quality of life. Now, and there's other lines of evidence as well that indicate that the attention on CBD is at least somewhat warranted. However, there is a lot of pseudoscience surrounding CBD as well, where people are claiming that it can cure everything from, depression to multiple sclerosis. And far be it from me to, suggest that those anecdotes are misinformed or are exaggerated. I mean, these are the personal experiences of folks, and that's a valuable source of information. It is, however, the lowest quality source of information. I don't mean that they are low quality people or anything like that. It's just in terms of the hierarchy of just how valuable data is in science, that is the least controlled. We don't know anything about their family history of other diseases and disorders. We don't know what they eat day to day. We don't know how much exercise they get. We don't know their age. All of these things that we know also influence a huge number of diseases and disorders. And at the most rigorous level of clinical evidence or scientific evidence, where we control for as many things as we possibly can, there's some evidence that CBD is beneficial, but I've not seen evidence that is beneficial for all the wide variety of things for which it is marketed. And so, just like with any other, hotly evolving or rapidly evolving domain of biomedical science, or certainly the supplement industry, I think, a healthy dose of skepticism is warranted. And, we're still in sort of a wait and see situation when it comes to CBD, apart from some pretty strong evidence that it's beneficial for some people with epilepsy. All right. I am way behind. Okay. Sheldon Cooper, National Health Service, UK. That's slightly an interesting topic. I don't have much relationship with it as I'm in the United States. What is pseudoscience? So, God, that's a really interesting topic. There's like so many ways. So there's an interesting book written by somebody named Emily Ogden about the term mesmerism. So you might use the word mesmerize. And for the longest time, I thought it was just like, a word like amazing or whatever. But it's actually derived from a person, a guy, Anton Mesmer. And he arose in a period of American history where there was sort of the emergence of a bunch of pseudoscientific disciplines to treat things like, what we might call depression today, or any kind of malady. And they would use a sort of science-y kind of approach. For example, they would apply X-rays. X-rays had recently been, developed, X-ray machines, for the treatment of anything. They would use, electrical current for the treatment of a variety of things. But it was just the appeal that it was like, clearly there was some science behind this, but they didn't go the next step and actually evaluate the evidence of their efficacy of the treatment. But for somebody who didn't have a background in science, it appeared to be very remarkably, almost magical, right? The things that you could all of a sudden do with electricity had never been seen before by a lot of people, let alone X-rays, where you can actually see inside the body, right? And so that is a sort of an example of pseudoscience, where there is a sort of a grain of scientific evidence at the heart of a bunch of additional claims that are not based on evidence, that are based on extrapolation or sort of leaps of belief. And generally speaking, there is a profit motive behind a lot of it. And so as a result, it is the manipulation of a little bit of science to deliver a very gratifying, reasonable answer for a question that ails you, or a concern, or an ailment. But they're not holding themselves to the highest level of scrupulousness that good scientists would. And oftentimes they're not scientists; they're marketeers or whatever it might be, salesmen, as was the case back in that era. So that's just using a relatively uncontroversial topic because nobody's really a mesmerist these days. But you can draw corollary, or you could draw parallels to modern versions of that, right? Where people are telling you, I have the answer for why your child has autism. I have the answer for, why you're unhappy, or why, you can't lose weight. And, the reality is oftentimes the human body is extremely complicated. Biomedical science is extraordinarily complicated. Oftentimes we don't really have the whole answer. We have part of the answer. But that's not gratifying for, people who are suffering. So, all right. Cannabis is great for treating anorexia. It can be helpful it depends. I mean, anorexia nervosa is a psychiatric condition. I don't know that actually cannabis has been evaluated for its treatment specifically, but certainly anorexia associated with like cancer chemotherapy, it is quite helpful for some people at least. All right, we are getting a call from, I believe, his name is Wes. We'll see if the connection goes through. So Wes, is that your name? And if so, where are you calling from?
Yes, that's my name.
Where are you calling from?
That's my name. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Hold on.
Okay. Let's see if there's any other topics. I should say thank you very much for the super hearts from C. Anderson. Yes, I can hear you, Wes.
Oh, okay. I just it took a second for me to get my phone connected. All right, I have a couple questions for you. I love your scope, by the way.
Thank you very much. What's on your mind?
Very intelligent guy. Know a lot. But I want to ask you some tough questions.
We'll see. I'll do my best. I'm no more intelligent than anybody else in here, I promise.
Okay. Well, I asked you about therapies for TBI and CTE, which is prevalent in the armed service community, which I used to be involved in, and ex-athlete. And there's a lot of my colleagues, friends, ex-teammates that are suffering.
Yeah.
They're the ones that are going to CBD, which doesn't help. Okay, and I agree with you. There's not a lot of science. A lot of the science is bro science. It's not helping these guys. They're going to all ends of the earth. So I wanted to ask you what therapies are out there, even if they're experimental, that can help with TBI or CTE. And then I have a follow-up question.
Well, okay, so I completely agree with you. Bro science is another sort of iteration of pseudoscience, right? And so, you're absolutely right. TBI is a central challenge for both the athletic community and the military community. So when it comes to treatments that are uniquely effective for TBI, that is an area of ongoing research. Oftentimes, most of the treatments are palliative, meaning you're really trying to treat the symptoms that arise due to the TBI. So oftentimes people can experience a heightened anxiety or impulse control issues or sleeplessness or depression, very commonly. And, there is no, silver bullet treatment for the pathology of TBI. I know a lot of preclinical studies that are going on right now to try and understand the biology of traumatic brain injury, but I'm not aware of any treatments that are like uniquely being evaluated to treat TBI. I'm sorry to say. I know that's not a particularly gratifying answer, but
no, and it's not. It is very frustrating because you do have a lot of people that are coming on the market with these so-called, new inventions or bro therapies. I want to say like laser therapy, or even some maybe peptides, or Scott, there's so many things out there, too many to name. But inflammation is the big, back to your inflammation, it's the big keystone in all this. The inflammation that occurs after the injury have to be addressed, because there's a cascade of problems that happen if the inflammation's not addressed.
That's right. Yeah. And so, that inflammatory signaling isn't necessarily unique to traumatic brain injury. And so a lot of studies are evaluating, or a lot of groups are evaluating the possibility of helping to treat a variety of brain, neurodegenerative disorders, and a bunch of brain-related diseases by targeting the inflammatory signaling cascade. There could be peptides that would be effective at interfering with that inflammatory signaling. But again, I'm not aware of any studies that have, or any clinical trials that have successfully mitigated inflammation, in the central nervous system using any of these peptides quite yet.
Right. Back to your inflammation, someone had a question about inflammation. My mother was a dentist, and one thing that people really overlook as far as heart disease and early dementia, I think there was a published paper recently that gum disease that not treated, gingivitis that's not treated, gum disease that's not treated, this bacteria that's in the mouth sets a precedence for early dementia or even heart disease. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Have you heard any of this research?
Yeah, absolutely. So broadly speaking, this is a domain of biomedical science called microbiome, or the microbiome. And so pretty much every compartment of our body, from our mouth, as you're noting, to our gut, to our eyeballs, to our ears, pretty much every compartment is inhabited by a variety of different microbes, some of which are benign, they don't really affect us, some of which may be beneficial, and some of which it seems are deleterious to health. Most of the attention has been paid to the gut microbiome, in other words, the microbes that inhabit your digestive system, your intestines, pretty much. And there have been that some folks might be familiar with some of the headlines of fecal transplants and things like that. And a lot of that is arising from it's a lot of like genetics research that's then coupled with metabolomics, or metabolic conditions. But then there's also some evidence that some of these microbes that inhabit, again, the mouth or the gut, can actually have effects on the central nervous system, affecting everything from predispositions to mood-related psychiatric conditions to potentially dementia. Yes. We're still at a stage in the microbiome research where those correlations are being enumerated and then also confirmed by other groups. And there is some research into potentially treating some of these conditions by seeding the gut microbiome, for example, with beneficial microbes. In preclinical models, that has been shown that, preclinical models, meaning animal models, like that animal pathologies can be corrected by seeding their microbial populations with beneficial microbes. And there have been some human clinical trials suggesting really clear benefits. So I mean, that at this point, we're no longer at the stage where it's like, could there be a problem if you have a unique signature of microbes in your gut or in your gums? We're no longer asking that question. It is more, okay, that's for sure. So what are the microbes? How can we intervene competently? And will it yield health benefits? And the broad consensus is that, yes, there will be some benefits.
They think some even gut microbes might be involved in schizophrenia and bipolar.
So, I mean, but it's worth keeping in mind that a lot of those claims are derived from correlative studies where they take a big group of people with schizophrenia or depression or bipolar disorder and sample their microbial populations, and they find, hey, in this group of people, when we compare them to people that don't have these conditions, we tend to see an enrichment or a high level of this particular population. And that's sort of where it ends. In some cases, they'll do a preclinical study in animal models where they can of replicating those two different microbial signatures and then correcting the one with associated with, let's say, schizophrenia or depression, and then they show improvements. But we're still sort of at that phase where nobody ought to go out and just buy a bunch of prebiotics under the assumption that that's going to cure whatever ails you. But in the future, in the not too distant future, that may very well be an adjunct treatment for all of these conditions.
Fantastic. If someone's going to study that mind-gut connection, would they go into neuroscience like you're doing, or would they go into like a microbiology discipline?
So you could do either. So I know many neuroscience labs that had started out as mood researchers or addiction researchers that have added on a microbiome component. There's a lot of funding available for microbiome research. You could do immunology, you could do microbiology. If you happen to be most interested in the effects of microbes on the brain, neuroscience would probably be the best preparation for understanding that relationship, because the brain is pretty complicated. But nobody owns microbiome research. It's a very collaborative field.
Well, thank you very much for taking my call. I'll get off and let other people ask questions. I'd like to support your podcast or Periscope somehow. What should I do? Go to PayPal or SuperHearts?
Oh, that's really nice of you. I mean, whatever works for you. I have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/ slash anthropoid. You can get it all through my, I don't know if you can get it through my Twitter, but it's patreon.com/ anthropoid, or, whatever is easiest for you. I really appreciate it, Wes.
I will. Thank you very much.
Take it easy. Day. You too.
Bye-bye.
Great topics. Man, covered a lot. Okay. Why does the sun catch fire on your skin? Why does the sun catch fire on your skin? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Why does the sun damage your skin? So the sun is emitting a whole, if you look at the electromagnetic spectrum, that is like the spectrum of all kinds of radiation, from Bluetooth to Wi-Fi to, microwave to X-rays. There's also visible light. That is part of the electromagnetic spectrum. That's the sliver of the EM spectrum that enables us to see. That's what we evolved to use to give us the most up-to-date information about our surroundings, because photons are bouncing off of things all the time, and so we get up-to-date information at the speed of light. It's delivered to our nervous system at the speed of light. Our nervous system is much slower than the speed of light. But then so the sun is putting out all of this kind of radiation, but some of that radiation is ultraviolet, and ultraviolet radiation, when exposed to the skin, particularly if you have low melanin levels, can induce carcinogenic activity. It can cause DNA breaks. It can just interfere with our biology in a way that causes cells that compose our skin, or primarily skin when it comes to sun exposure, skin cells to behave in aberrant ways and to potentially mutate in such a way as they begin replicating uncontrollably. And the immune system can't tamp it down, or the immune system isn't even aware that this is happening, that it can't detect this aberrant cellular activity. It normally would, but in some cases it can't. And then you get carcinogenic activity, you get cancer growth. So that's why you should wear sunscreen. All right. Go on documentaries, you'll be shocked. Do monkey blood people eat human flesh? I don't know at all what you're talking about. Monkeys, however, well, not really monkeys. I don't know how violent monkeys are, but other great apes are very violent. Chimpanzees are extraordinarily violent. There was a time where I was just I'm still very fascinated by them, but infinitely fascinated by chimpanzees and bonobos. I could just watch videos of them just forever, just because of how human they kind of appear in some cases, and some of their behaviors really resemble human behaviors. And one of those set of behaviors is how violent they can be to each other. And so that is within our genetic heritage. We didn't evolve from chimpanzees, but we share a common ancestor. They evolved from something from which we evolved. And so we share some of that, at least. My ex is bipolar, son paranoid, schizophrenic, granddaughter nonverbal autistic. Oh, warrior grandma, yeah. XYG. I recall talking to you about this. All right. The brain has so many individualized fields of study. To be a PhD, he has narrowed. So, Phanerona, that is absolutely true. I was lucky, however, to have started talking to people outside of science pretty early on in my PhD, and as a result, because I'm affiliated with an academic institution, I have access to so much of the literature that is so expensive if you are not in academia, which is a huge problem, in my opinion. So it's really motivated me to read beyond my discipline. And so whenever I do a podcast, for example, I'm not just doing it from memory. I do a pretty extensive literature review, and I post all the literature that I end up using for the podcast. I read way more than I end up using for the podcast. And so you can follow along. You can get the papers yourself or ask somebody for them if you want them. But you're right. I mean, a PhD is devoted to a specific domain within a field, because you're theoretically, hopefully, discovering something that nobody's discovered before, and we've been at this for a while now, and so a lot of people have discovered a lot of the easy to discover things. Okay. Is that why it's so much pollution? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Have you harmed a lab rat? I have not. Okay. Okay, I'm falling behind. How much will we advance if they make it too costly? I'm not sure what you're... Oh, Johnny Valent. Okay, I'm clearly missing earlier comments from you. So sorry about that. Any knowledge or experience with vitiligo? So, Rebel Dog Duke. I personally have no personal experience with vitiligo. For anybody that's not familiar, that is a condition. It's pretty benign, where you have differences in pigmentation of the skin, and so it is most apparent, generally speaking, in people who have a lot more, more melanin in their skin, so they're tanner, just darker colored skin, because the areas that are not producing as much melanin will be comparatively quite lighter, and so the contrast is starker. But pretty much anybody can have vitiligo. One of my good friends actually has, very white person, has light skinned guy, has vitiligo, and it's almost indetectable until he tells you about it. Now, I don't know about the basic biology of vitiligo, or if it's associated with anything that is less benign, but that's pretty much what vitiligo is. Okay. What are your professional thoughts on NDE in the brain during such events? So I'm just another human. Good to see you again. I am also just another human. So NDEs, for anybody that's not familiar with that initialism, is a near-death experience. And I have some thoughts about near-death experiences. I think, the most important part of a near-death experience is the fact that it's near death. It is not death, right? So whatever experiences you're having are not the same as death because you didn't die. And, in clinical settings, oftentimes they'll refer to a moment of death by a specific biological measure. The heart stopped beating, or there ceased to be significant electrical activity, electrophysiological activity in the brain. And so that is technically what the moment that they consider to be death. But if you are alive after that, you didn't die, right? So that's an important consideration, because you can have all these exotic experiences, but that doesn't mean that that is what people experience after they're dead. And it is also important to note that during a near-death experience, that is a fundamentally unique state that is affecting you in a very potent way. Let's say you are being deprived of air, you're potentially drowning or something like that. Your brain is being deprived of oxygen, and that is going to very dramatically affect how brain cells behave. You're going to have a progressive shutdown, starting at the most or the least necessary to sustain fundamental life, to sustain the basic stuff that keeps you alive. And as that happens, if somebody were to come over here with a very powerful magnet and just turn off parts of my cortex, my state of consciousness would change very significantly. In fact, I might move uncontrollably. I might feel things that aren't actually touching me. I might be able to have even more exotic states of consciousness, like feeling as though I'm outside of my body, looking at my body. And I'm not dying, right? This is just a modification of brain activity. And so when somebody is experiencing a near-death experience, that kind of thing is happening. And so you're going to have an altered state of consciousness. Just like you have an altered state of consciousness when you stand in front of some gorgeous, beautiful natural formation, like the Grand Canyon or Niagara Falls. Like, this is so magnificent. It's so much bigger than me. And it's been here for so much longer than me. And it'll be here for so much longer after I'm gone. Like, that is an altered state of consciousness. And so there have been studies that evaluate, okay, can we confirm some of the perceptual experiences that people describe during a near-death experience? Can we confirm them scientifically, rigorously? And I've never seen any compelling evidence that, like, for example, a lot of people experience the sensation when they're in a clinical when they're in a surgical setting because they've been shot or they're, close to their demise. They experience this floating like sensation. And there have been evaluations of whether or not that can be confirmed, whether or not they did indeed, their consciousness did indeed depart from their corporeal, from their body. And they just haven't been able to find any evidence that it actually happens. And if you have any knowledge of the effects of some, drugs that very potently alter your state of consciousness in very significant ways, like, for example, psychedelics, it is very, very clear that you can induce all kinds of modifications of consciousness without having to damage the brain or physically modify the brain. And so for me, I think a lot of these experiences can be explained by relatively prosaic biology, relatively simple biology, and that is that the brain is acting differently, right? Brain cells activity is changing, and that necessarily will change how you experience the world and how you experience your inner self. So that's my perspective. I know it's not the most romantic, but think of it this way. I think it is actually pretty romantic, right? If you think about like our day-to-day experience, that our brain is cobbling together this very comprehensive, this very believable, very vivid conscious experience from its sensory systems. It is essentially hallucinating this reality, and we don't call it a hallucination because our hallucinations are so similar to each other day to day. When you perturb that system, all of a sudden you have a completely new reality because the system that has been delivering to you this hallucinated reality has been altered. I think that's really remarkable that, out of evolution grew this reality simulator that resides within our skull. And it's so fragile, it's so sensitive, that if you just give it just a little bit of a small molecule, all of a sudden you are seeing the walls breathe and you're communing with the greater consciousness, right? That to me is remarkable. I don't think we need to invoke any kind of metaphysics to explain that. It is more mundane and more amazing at the same time. All right. I like the view that we are hallucinating. Yeah, so there's a neuroscientist from, I always forget which city he's from the UK. Anil Seth, I believe is his name. That has a great talk about, like, he frames it in that way. Where at this point, it used to be, I think, kind of like a controversial thing to suggest that, your concept of self, the thing that is most intimate to you, that nobody can interfere with, that nobody can directly affect without just interacting with you, your sense of who you are, is actually a fabrication. It is a thing that the brain needs to generate to be able to survive. And that now many neuroscientists subscribe to that depiction of the sense of self, that there is no such thing really, that it is a convenient illusion that we rely upon so that we can just function day to day. All right. It was a TED conference from a doctor who recorded their people weeks before their death. I'm not quite. Oh, I think I know it. You're referring to the near-death experience. Talk about S-zopiclone and other sleep meds. Sure. So S-zopiclone, like Zopiclone, Zolpidem, these are a family of medications called, they're called sedative hypnotics, and then informally referred to as Z-drugs, which I think is very cool. It's extreme. So these sedative hypnotics, they're kind of similar to benzodiazepines, which are GABAergic in their activity. They're positive allosteric modulators, meaning that they change the way that the GABA receptor, which is the primary inhibitory receptor in the nervous system, it causes neurons to relax when it's activated, to stop firing impulses so readily. Benzodiazepines bind that receptor, and they cause that receptor to be more sensitive to when GABA binds. That's why it's a positive allosteric modulator. It's not an agonist, in other words, if you're steeped in pharmacological terminology. Sedative hypnotics or the Z drugs, like Ambien, for example, I believe is Zolpidem or Zopiclone, I can't remember which, it also this family of drugs also binds a benzodiazepine receptor in a different spot, and they also I believe bind the GABA B receptor a lot more than the benzodiazepines do, which tend to bind the GABA A receptor. This is a little bit arcane probably for most people, but they very effectively induce sedation, and that's why it can be very helpful for people who are jet lagged, for example, or for people that have just irreparable insomnia. It used to be prescribed a lot more frequently than it is today. Now we have, I think, physicians, broadly speaking, have a deeper appreciation for how important sleep is and how important natural sleep is. Anyways, oh, jeez. This fool forgot to plug in his cell phone. Okay, we're all good now. Jeez. Can you tell I'm getting older? Anyways, so what's interesting about the Z-drugs, though, is that some people seem to be biologically prone to experiencing a set of side effects from the Z-drugs that really don't occur with benzodiazepines or the sort of earlier version of a benzodiazepine, the barbiturates, which are used very infrequently these days because they're actually more dangerous than benzodiazepines. And that is oftentimes people will enter into a sort of pseudo-hypnotic state where they're awake or they're actively moving, but they're sort of in a liminal phase between sleep and waking. And that's when we got all of these wild stories of people like they took their Ambien and then they drove to, their local corner store and bought like a bunch of ice cream and ate it all, or like, they end up sleepwalking a lot, and, engaging in reckless behavior because after all, they're not actually awake. And so it seems to be the case that some people are biologically predisposed to responding to that family of drugs in that way, whereas others are not. And so they're helpful drugs, but just like most sedatives, they're not really optimally applied in a kind of chronic administration, right? It's not inducing a nutritional sleep state. But sleep is important enough that if you're deprived of sleep, it can be worth it. But that's a calculation that a physician will make. Thanks very much for the super hearts, Lulu. I really appreciate it. It's very generous of you. Okay, that's bananas. It is bananas. Yeah, some of those stories were absolutely wild. Once binded to the GABA A receptors, do they remain in your brain permanently? Universal, yeah. So once again, we're referring to the benzodiazepine class of drugs. And just so if anybody's unfamiliar with benzodiazepines, we're talking about drugs like Xanax, otherwise called alprazolam, or Valium, otherwise called diazepam, or Klonopin, clonazepam. These are drugs that bind the GABA A receptor. And the reason that we have all these different versions of benzodiazepines, apart from the fact that different companies want to make their own version and not get sued for patent infringement, that's the main reason. That's actually the real reason that we have all these benzodiazepines. But the clinical pharmacological reason is that they are distinguished from each other by how long they bind the receptor, how strongly they bind the receptor, and so none of them stay permanently in your brain. But some of them will bind the GABA A receptor. So if you think of a receptor like my hand, these drugs are binding the side of the receptor. They're not binding the binding pocket where GABA, the neurotransmitter, would bind. They're binding like the side of it. And so, these molecules get into the brain. They, the neurons are bathed in a fluid that enables them to reach these receptors, bind them. And then depending upon the chemistry of those, the literal structure of the molecule of alprazolam versus diazepam, they can stay bound to the receptor for longer or shorter, and then eventually be knocked off and be eliminated from your central nervous system. What's interesting about diazepam, however, is that like most drugs, when you consume them, they are altered by your gastrointestinal system by enzymes that are present in your GI. And the reason that diazepam or Valium is so long lasting relative to Xanax or Klonopin is that diazepam is then converted to other benzodiazepines that are also active, like oxazepam and lorazepam, both of which can also be used independently. But as a result, once you've taken the diazepam and some of it's gotten into your brain, some of it will then be converted to another benzodiazepine that then will get access to your brain, and then some of that will then get converted to another benzodiazepine. So that's why you have that protracted effect. It's not actually because the diazepam itself is binding for quite as long as the duration of effect of the drug. But no, none of these drugs stay permanently in your brain. Can I have a better foresight of events before they happen? So that is a remarkable feature of what it is to be human, right? This is not true for all animals. That not only do we have, the capacity to travel backwards in time, mentally, right, using memory, and we don't have a perfect time travel machine in our brain, but we have a pretty damn good one, right? You can remember things that happened to you years and years and years ago. You're not going to have a perfect memory of it, but you're going to be able to remember the broad strokes. But we can also forecast future events given prior information. And in fact, that ability is so central to what it is to be human that it sort of serves the foundation for a lot of things that you wouldn't even think of. So, for example, When you're sitting in wherever you're sitting, maybe you're outside, maybe you're in your bedroom or your living room, you are making predictions about your environment. You don't know that you're doing that, but you are. You're predicting, for example, that my air conditioner's on. I turned it on. It should be on. And so you're not thinking like, hey, is it really 70 degrees? Or if I had it my way and my wife didn't like it so hot, it would be like 65 degrees. Also, I have a baby. 65 degrees is probably too cold for a baby. But my wife would have it at like 85 degrees, which would just literally cause me to explode. Anyways, I'm not constantly thinking to myself like, okay, check. Is it, 70 degrees? Is it 68 degrees? Yes. Okay. I'm just predicting that it is. And then if all of a sudden I'm hot and I know that I turned the thermostat down to, 68 or whatever, 70, then all of a sudden my nervous system delivers to me the fact that my prediction is wrong, that there's an error, and then I correct for that error. I go and evaluate, hey, is the thermostat broken? Is the air conditioner broken? Blah, blah, blah. And by the way, so that fundamental, you're predicting features of your environment is true not only for like that kind of thing, which is fairly intuitive, like you do that. You know that you don't think about your air conditioning all the time until something goes wrong with it. That is also true for how our visual system works. So, for example, and it's actually the way that essentially all visual illusions work, is that part of our visual system is devoted to predicting various features of a visual experience. And I wish I had some visual illusions prepared for this, because some of them are very, very simple and easy to demonstrate. But so, in describing them to you, it won't really like be very gratifying, because if you don't see it, you won't believe it. But we evolved under certain circumstances with a sun above our head when it's up, with, in other words, directional light. And so our entire evolution was sculpted by that is the source of light. And so as a result, when you play with a visual stimulus and you play with the direction of light, you can be tricked into thinking a color is much darker than it really is. And that's because your brain is predicting that this is shade that's induced by a certain part, the source of light, which is the sun. Evolutionarily, that's where the source of light is. And you make an error. It's an illusion. As a result, it's an illusion. Even further, part of what is at the heart of that error correction system, of that predicting future events and either getting it right or learning from the error, one of the central neurophysiological systems undergirding that ability is the same neurophysiological system that undergirds addiction, or at least part of the neurophysiology of addiction. That's the mesocortical limbic dopaminergic circuit. You might have recognized dopamine, and then I said a bunch of other stuff. Dopamine. It's a dopamine signaling system that arises from the tippy top of your brainstem, essentially, that then sends a bunch of dopamine out forward, anterior, towards the front of the brain, to regions called the ventral striatum, as well as the prefrontal cortex. And so, I can train an ape, a chimpanzee, for example, where every time I reach out my hand, I have a grape in it. Chimps love grapes. It's like the champagne of fruit for chimpanzees, assuming that you like champagne. Who doesn't like champagne? Anyway, so every single time, I'm sitting next to a chimp. Every single time I reach out my hand, I have a grape. Chimp takes the grape, loves the grape, and waits for me to do it again. I keep doing it, keep giving grapes to this chimp. And then all of a sudden I reach out my hand and it's empty. And the chimp is like, hey, where's my grape at? If you were to measure dopamine-producing neurons in that tippy top of the brainstem that I was talking about earlier, a brain region called the ventral tegmental area, if you were to measure what those dopamine neurons are doing, every time I hand out, particularly the first time, when I reach out my hand with the grape in it, those neurons begin chattering a lot. I keep doing it. Those neurons chatter, not as much as the first time, but they still chatter. They're predicting that, hey, he's reaching his hand out. I'm about to get a grape. He's reaching it out. And then that final time when I don't have a grape in my hand, those neurons are silent. And it's unpleasant because, hey, I'm not getting my grape. This good thing that I predicted was going to happen isn't happening. What's the deal? And that is very unpleasant. That's part of the reason for why withdrawal from alcohol, nicotine, opioids is so unpleasant. It is that primal, everything is wrong right now feeling. Okay, so how can you get better at predicting future events? I don't know that there is a great way to do it, but the way that we do that, the way that capacity in humans is funded by a well of experience, right? What do you use to predict future events? Let's say you're playing tennis. Very simple example. Let's say you're playing tennis, or ping pong, or table tennis, whatever you want to call it. You're making predictions about where the ball is going to land based off of how your opponent hit the ball, where the ball is initially traveling. You don't know for certain where the ball is going to land on your side, but you can get yourself ready and then make corrections as it gets closer. And then that window of variability shrinks down to literally where it hits the table or hits your paddle. And how do you develop that expertise? Well, you practice, right? You develop experience that will inform you when the ball is hit by my opponent like this, it's going to go over there. When it's hit like that, it's going to go over there, and so on. That same fundamental principle underlies one's ability to predict events in the stock market, or how a girl is going to react to your pickup line, right? It's the same fundamental thing. So the argument I'm making to you is get more experience. That was a long tirade, but can you tell that this is kind of like what I study? So that's why I went on and on. Okay. Or the prediction of those events in something like déjà vu. Well, very interesting topic. I talked, for anybody that's interested in déjà vu, I talked about déjà vu at length on my podcast called Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify, and where all fine audiophonic stimulation is derived or is found. Déjà vu is an interesting phenomenon. It does arise from error in prediction. So I'll give you an example. It turns out that folks who tend to travel more frequently, they tend to experience déjà vu more frequently. This was just a correlative, it doesn't mean that it is the travel, getting on a plane and going somewhere is the thing, the active ingredient inducing déjà vu more frequently. But if you think, what is déjà vu? Déjà vu is inappropriate familiarity. It's the sensation of familiarity. I've done this before. I've seen this before. Despite the fact that you also scrutinize that feeling and know that you ought not be familiar with this. I've never met this person, or I've never been in this place. And so it is an erroneous sensation of familiarity. And so if you think about, it's perhaps ought to be unsurprising that somebody who travels very frequently, is in novel environments very frequently, would be more prone to déjà vu because, after all, we're all humans. We all, move about our lives in similar ways. We all eat food. We all drink fluids. We all have a language of some sort. We have, places, either countrysides or urban areas with roads or some kind of conduit of traffic and foot travel. And so there are some pretty consistent similarities to the human experience no matter where you are. And so as a result, you might, hey, this alley in Philadelphia reminds me exactly of this alley in New York City. In fact, have I been in this alley before? No, you haven't, but hey, it's pretty similar. And so déjà vu. Now, I went deep on déjà vu on the podcast. Again, it's called Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher and, where you find podcasts. It was a more interesting episode than I expected because I didn't know how much research there was into déjà vu until I started that literature review. You keep using prediction, but it's really stimulus interpretation. Simple automata equation, really. Fanarona, that's an interesting take. I mean, so it's not stimulus interpretation. It is prediction. And so it is really most accurately described as reward prediction is really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about like the grapes and addiction. So, when we talk about like why a drug like alcohol or nicotine or, whatever, any drug really that people do for fun and they're prone to addiction to it, we oftentimes just use the word reward because the drugs are rewarding. And that is true in a sense, but when we're talking about the relationship that dopamine has with these drugs, it's actually not the delivery system of reward, technically. It's actually the anticipation of reward. And more accurately, it's salience. How important is this experience in this moment? Is it novel? Is it good? Is it bad? I'm using prediction because that is how that's our conscious relationship with this system, but it is really predicting reward, predicting if something good is going to happen. Somebody called in and I missed it. Sorry about that. Feel free to call back in. All right. I'm sure I've seen the scope before. There you go. Well, I've talked about déjà vu quite a bit. So stock market example. Well, I mean, Rebel Dog Duke, like I don't know. Maybe you're saying like nobody can really predict the stock market, but people have. Like people predicted the crash in 2008. It wasn't a stock market crash, although it resulted in a stock market crash. People can do that, right? It's just if they have the right preliminary evidence, preliminary knowledge, they can do it. So yeah. For example, birds of prey predict location of prey when swooping down. That's exactly. I mean, yeah. But it's not like when a bird hatches, they can do that, right? They have to learn to do that. They make errors all the time. They don't always nail their prey, right? If you were down at the beach with me and my family, me and the girls, down at the beach, observing seagulls, I guess, some kind of bird, swooping down to try and get something to eat out of the ocean, you would see them miss a lot. They miss all the time. Now, some birds are probably better than others, but yeah, no, I mean, and by the way, I mean, I don't know enough about the neurophysiology of birds to confirm that the same system is involved, but they have dopamine signaling systems. So, yeah. You could psychic your friends. Well, you can predict a lot of your friend's behavior, right? Like, if you know your friend, I mean, people oftentimes will say like, oh man, Alex, he never disappoints, right? Because predictable behavior. I prefer heroin to grapes. A lot of people do. A lot of people don't, though. Like when we talk about opioids, this is another reason that I really want to write about opioids, is because the way we talk about opioids is like they are so addictive that if you're exposed to them one time, you're going to get addicted. People used to say that about cocaine, too, by the way. And that's just not true. Most people that are prescribed opioids never develop addiction. A lot of people find them very aversive. They make them They make them feel nauseous. They make them feel stupid and sluggish. But there is a minority of people, among whom I count myself, by the way, that find them extraordinarily euphoric. And oftentimes you'll hear people say, and in fact, back in the day, somebody called in when I was doing more phone calls, and he had recently been treated. He had like some kind of knee surgery, I think, and he had never had opioids before. He was prescribed, I think, Percocet. And he was clearly confronting the issue that he loved the drug. And he would say things like, I never felt this normal. And I just feel fantastic. I'm more productive. I feel more excited. I feel more creative. And I tell him like that is the thing. That is what makes it very clear that you're vulnerable to addiction. And then he would say things like, but what's the problem? I mean, why not consume this drug if it makes me feel this good? And that is like classic addiction rationalizing. And, frank, philosophically, I don't have an answer for why you shouldn't do that. I mean, who am I to tell you what to do with your life? But it was a wonderful, if not very tragic, encapsulation of why it is that some people, when exposed to opioids, develop addiction, and a lot of people don't. Most people, again, do not. Okay, so somebody on YouTube. Oh, Fat Tad Rider. Good to see you again, man. May have missed the emergence of consciousness part of your video. Do you think consciousness is possible without memory? Can you experience consciousness in a total absence of memory? So that's an interesting topic. So hi from Storm Lake, Iowa. Hello from Philadelphia. Center City, Philadelphia. Pennsylvania. So it's an interesting concept, the relationship between memory and consciousness. So, different neuroscientists have different perspectives on this. I am of the opinion, I am a member of the camp that posits that consciousness is not an black or white. It's not a threshold thing. Well, it's not an all or nothing phenomenon. It is a spectrum. And different animals over the millions of years that we've been evolving have developed varying degrees of consciousness. And now how precisely you characterize consciousness is up for debate. It's kind of a tedious conversation. But do you have self-actualization? Do you have language? Do you have at least the illusion of choice? And so in any case, I think it is an error to suggest that dogs, for example, do not have a consciousness, or even mice do not have a consciousness. They do. It's just far more confined. And so, many of those animals have memory of some sort. They don't, none of them really have the same complexity of their memory or the same broadly encompassing versatility of memory, let's say. And so I think that part of why human consciousness is so uniquely comprehensive is that we do have such wonderful memories compared to other animals. Again, we do not have perfect memories, and computers are better at certain kinds of memory than we are already, even though they're not artificially intelligent. But I don't think that it is a prerequisite to having a conscious organism. I don't know if I'm being completely clear on that, but I think that the sophistication of human memory is part of the reason for why human consciousness is so sophisticated. But its absence does not abrogate a consciousness, right? It does not eliminate the ability for an animal to be conscious. Should I cut on milk and cheese if I have hypothyroidism? XRX. It's kind of a cool way to spell that sound. So hypothyroidism, for anybody that's not familiar, Hashimoto's disease, I believe, is its term, its name. But hypothyroidism, I think, is a better way to term it because it states clearly what it is. It is an unusually low level of production of the thyroid hormone. And thyroid is one of these master regulatory hormones, regulates everything from metabolism, like how you absorb nutrients from food, how you burn stored caloric energy, like fat or glycogen or whatever it might be. But it also affects like energy levels and sort of your cognitive acuity and stuff like that. I am not aware of any relationship between dairy products, and I don't know if you said eggs, but I'm not aware of any effects of dairy on hypothyroidism. If you're concerned about like weight, that kind of stuff, I still probably wouldn't be too concerned about it. But I would have to look up and see if there's any complication there. I would be very surprised. Not all hypothyroidism is Hashimoto's, of course. So yeah, Hashimoto's, much like Graves' disease, is a specific. It refers to a specific interaction. Like Graves' disease, for example, is a specific antibody-mediated interaction with the thyroid. Yeah, right. But generally speaking, people might be familiar with Hashimoto's and not be aware of hypothyroidism. But anyways, the relationship between illusion and choice. So I suspect you're bringing up the illusion of choice, right? Which is a phrase I used. So this is, this is really free will is what we're talking about, whether or not free will actually exists as we popularly conceive of it. Some neuroscientists will make a sort of sleight of hand trick and say free will is what humans do. And so if you define it as, humans have free will by definition, and therefore you compare all other animals to humans, and that's how you designate the presence or absence of free will. I mean, I think that sort of is like a completely different conversation. I think if you were to walk up to anybody on the street in Philly and ask, hey, what do you think free will is? They wouldn't define it as that. They would suggest that like, I am free to make any choice that I want to make, unencumbered by any other sort of force outside of myself, outside of my mind. Some folks will have a more spiritual or religious conception of it. But that's generally speaking what I'm talking about. And neurophysiologically, there's just not a physical substrate, a neighborhood in the brain where I can see free will emerging, particularly given the relationship between our conscious awareness and our subconscious processes. The majority of the brain is devoted to processes with which we have no agency, right? We can't affect, our friend here can't affect consciously by will alone their levels of thyroid release. You can't consciously affect dopamine release, serotonin release. You can engage in behaviors to affect those things, but what is it that's causing you to engage in those behaviors? Is it the low levels of dopamine? In which case, was it the low level of dopamine that caused you to make that choice in the first place? And so it's just as a concept, it begins to break down when you evaluate it in the context of the relationship between brain activity and human behavior. and you can neuroscientists can predict a choice that a person will make before that person is consciously aware that they made the choice, which is sort of speaking to that relationship between the subconscious and conscious, mind. And so, I think it is an illusion that is adaptive, and so that's sort of what we were talking about there. All right. Why do I feel dizzy when I eat apples? I could not tell you. Apples are pretty benign. I love apples. I've never felt dizzy after eating an apple. I don't know if you have diabetes. There is, fructose present in apples, and one could imagine, an insulin-related reaction to that sugar. But I'm not aware of any like pharmacological effect of any active ingredient of apples that might cause that kind of an effect. So barring some kind of more unique psychological relationship with apples or the flavor of apples that you might have developed over the course of your life, one might be concerned about diabetes or hypoglycemia or something like that. But if that happens to you, you should totally bring that up with a physician, because it's not a typical reaction to apples. All right. What's the scientific state of being mind effed? Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by that. If you mean like amazed, like, whoa, this is blowing my mind, man. That is a sensation. That is like a thing that your brain is delivering to you. The sensation of profundity, or the experience of profundity. Like, this is profound. This is so much bigger than I am. I can't believe that this is how the universe works. Like, when that team took a picture of the first black hole, that was amazing. That was so profound. It had never been done before. And we know that is a feeling that the brain generates because that it can be induced artificially using drugs. And so, and there are other reasons. You can also, it can also be a side effect of certain medications. But in any case, so it's part of how your brain determines whether or not any given stimulus is worthy of being remembered. You're not remembering the entirety of your life experience, of course. And so you're making decisions, your brain is making decisions automatically, subconsciously, about whether or not any given experience is unique enough or is important enough to you that it warrants being stored. And one way that it can do that is assigning this emotional valence, this perceptual valence of profundity, of, wow, this is so profound. This is blowing my mind, man. And by the way, I mentioned that it can be altered pharmacologically. So that's part of the reason for why a drug like cannabis is always associated with, like, whoa, dude, like that kind of a stereotype. There is a valid neurophysiological explanation for why people that are stoned can oftentimes be amazed a little bit more easily, because that system is in part regulated by the endogenous cannabinoid signaling system. All right. Scary. I can't eat apples. Oh no, I'm sorry to hear that. Better question for a neuroscientist would be, what is the psychology of being mind effed, or the physiology of being mind effed? So, Fanarona, it sounds like you're rather skeptical of neuroscience. I mean, I had to take many psychology classes. I'm certainly not a psychologist, but the only reason that I'm interested in neuroscience is due to its relevance to psychology. Yeah, but I talked a little bit to the neurophysiology of that. Right? Okay. Whoa, dude. Oh, somebody just called in, but I missed it again. Special Officer Doofy. Feel free to call back in. If you're thought about trying to get on the TV game show Jeopardy, I don't think I would do very well unless all of their questions were about neuroscience, which they're not. I just hammer on the point. I'm no more intelligent than anybody here, than anybody you know. I just happen to study a thing, for the past decade that most people don't have the privilege of getting to study. And but it is also one of the most intimate things in your life, your brain. Everybody has a relative that is suffering from some kind of brain-related condition, be it dementia or brain cancer or addiction. And so that is the only reason that you might think I'm more intelligent than I am. I am not as intelligent as you think I am. And I certainly would not fare well on Jeopardy, particularly in the pop culture categories. I would be destroyed, demolished. Endocannabinoid. Don't worry about ingesting a small amount of those, but for a dog, it's a serious thing. Apples? Kleenex. Can I donate my blood to someone if I have anemia? I'm not sure. That's a good question for a phlebotomist or for a physician. I'm not sure. Should Elon Musk be allowed to put chips in human brains? Well, it's worth noting that Elon Musk himself would not be doing it. They've developed a kind of, or they're in the process of developing a robot-assisted surgery platform, which there are already robot-assisted, why do I keep wanting to say assisted surgical platforms like the Da Vinci, for example, which helps to correct for some of the, surgeons very classically have very steady hands, but no human hand is perfectly steady. Right? There's always going to be some variability in motor activation because of the way that our motor system is regulated. And you can't just like lock a muscle. It has to there's constant biological activity enabling you to lock that muscle. And that is variable. And so, a lot of surgeries are robot assisted. And so, in other words, Elon Musk would not be himself doing the surgery, and a neurosurgeon wouldn't even necessarily, according to them, be performing the most direct surgery. But should anybody be allowed to put chips in brains? The short answer I would suggest is absolutely. I think the girls are back, by the way. So if you hear any coos, that is not me ventriloquizing any kind of sounds. That is the baby, or my wife imitating the baby. I think it is more unrealistic to suggest that we will never get to a point where technology is being integrated into our brain or into our body. Certainly, I mean, it already has been for a lot of conditions, right? So for some cases of Parkinson's disease, chips are implanted, right? Or certainly electrodes are implanted. Computer systems guide their activity. That is, of course, to ameliorate the severity of tremors from Parkinson's. But, so we're already there. The question is, can you amplify otherwise healthy brain activity using technology? And I would be shocked if within my lifetime there isn't some example of that. I think Neuralink and that presentation that they gave, that Elon Musk and his team gave a couple weeks ago now, was way over the top optimistic in terms of how soon they expect to be doing this. They were talking like in 2 years, which I would be shocked. But it is not utter science fiction what they're talking about doing. Did you hear her say that? It was da. She's gotten to da, which makes my heart swell with pride. And she's only saying da now, no more ma, which I think is also very meaningful. My wife is frowning, but my daughter is smiling. Okay. Bluetooth hacking people's brains. Welcome to the future. Yeah, totally. And this is something we talked about on the podcast, again, called Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher and, where other podcasts are found. We talked about Neuralink and whole brain computer interfaces, and that is definitely a very valid concern, is the vulnerability of any computer system to being hacked. And when it's integrated into the most, again, intimate part of your existence, the potential downsides are dramatic, potentially, right? It is a very serious concern, a very serious issue, but not only do I think it is going to be a benefit to human evolution, I think it's inevitable, right? Just like CRISPR, upon the inception of CRISPR, people all of a sudden were talking about the opportunity to modify people's, germline DNA, as though it was going to happen sometime in the future. It has now been attempted in humans. At least according to certain reports of this guy in China. Okay Now is calling in. Okay Now is calling in. So, Okay Now, what's your name and where are you calling from? Are you there? Hello? Priya, yeah. Where are you calling from?
Yes, Priya speaking. I'm calling from London,
Oh,
UK.
good to talk to you. What's on your mind?
Yes. I just wanted to ask you. You're doing a good show. I'm always watching the show. It's very good. And one day, hopefully, we all become scientists.
I love it. It's a great field. But yeah.
Yes,
So
yes. And I got a question for you.
all right, let's hear it.
I watched a YouTube video about addiction.
Okay.
And I wanted to let you know. And I wanted to ask you basically, how do we overcome addiction?
Well, that is a multi-billion-dollar question.
Is this something to do with the brain, or is it like something else?
So yeah, it's an interesting topic, and there are definitely different opinions out there. Right now, we really don't have an effective treatment for addiction. That's just the sad truth. Some drug addictions are easier to treat than others,
Yes.
but from nicotine to certainly opioids, there's really no solid treatment. So there are some folks who argue that addiction really arises from social factors, where people don't have a tribe, they don't feel purpose.
Yes.
And I think there's definitely some validity to that. There's no question. But we know enough about the biology of addiction to know that there are definitely genetic predispositions to addiction. There are definitely, there's definitely neurobiology that is consistently present in addiction, and so. It's not going to be one or the other. From my perspective, it's going to be some combination of both.
What do you think is more? Is it genetically, or is it like society?
Yeah, I mean, it's always an impossible question. It's always an impossible answer or question to answer satisfactorily. And here's why, right? Of course, the environment plays a crucial role, because if you're never exposed to heroin, you're not going to become a heroin addict, right? But if you don't have the genetic predisposition to finding heroin enjoyable, or finding it euphoric, you're also not going to become addicted to heroin, even if you're exposed to it. And so we don't talk about nature versus nurture anymore. We talk about a gene-environment interaction, and that is fundamental to addiction. I mean, addiction is the quintessential example of that. And so I know folks like Gaber Mate have opinions and that contrast with that, but I think most of the field appreciates that it is a combination of both.
All right, thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thanks for calling in, Pri.
All right, good talking to you. Thank you.
Likewise. Friend from London. I feel like I've talked to him before. All right, it's just Jeffrey is calling in now. I suspect his name is probably Jeffrey. So Jeffrey, where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Boston.
Right on. What's on your mind?
The people who fall and hit their head and then they become a genius. Is that true?
Oh, people with injuries to their brain that then develop some kind of cognitive abilities. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
So, extraordinarily rarely, very, very, very rarely, infinitesimally rarely, that can happen. So for example, there's an example of a gentleman from the UK who had epilepsy as a child, and he grew out of it, which can happen, but there was some damage that was done due to the epilepsy, and he developed this amazing mathematics faculty. He was able to do math at an extraordinarily advanced level, preternaturally. What's that?
Oh, no, continue.
Okay.
Sorry, that was just someone in the background.
No worries. And so, I mean, those kind, and he's not the only example. I believe his name is Daniel. I'm forgetting his name. Sorry about that. But those examples are very much so the exception to the rule. Injuries to the brain are almost without exception, a bad thing. And we even if we were like, okay, hey, let's try and replicate exactly what happened in this math prodigy's brain following the epilepsy, we wouldn't even know where to start. So what it does do is reveal a bit about how these abilities arise from some complex interaction between brain regions. But generally speaking, it is, or almost without exception, it is a very bad idea to hit your head on anything, and definitely doing it regularly.
Yeah, I see. No, that's interesting. So do we know exactly how that phenomenon happens?
So no, we can only speculate at this point. And, the speculation would be, so here's one way to think about it, right? Any behavior that you do, any outward behavior that you do is the byproduct of a bunch of different brain regions competing with one another, right? If you can think about like, if you're in a bar in Boston, right? There's a ton of people in there. You're trying to have a conversation with me right now, let's say, right? But we're in a bar in Boston and the Patriots are playing and everybody's yelling and getting rowdy. We can barely hear each other, right? If you could imagine if all of a sudden, and there was just a couple guys who were particularly loud, right? If you could imagine that they were kicked out because they started elbowing people, all of a sudden the room got quieter and we could hear each other a little bit better, right? There theoretically could be an example in the brain where there's something that is inhibiting our ability to, view numbers in a certain way. Numbers can take on a sort of, a sort of an anthropological characteristic, or in some cases, in folks with synesthesia, they can take on a verbal dimension where they're no longer just numbers. They have anytime you see the number 4, you experience the color green. And so if you could imagine, your relationship with numbers would be so fundamentally different from yours and mine, assuming you don't have that, where when I see numbers, I just see numbers. I just see the number 4, which means 4 number ones to me, whereas somebody with this modified brain might see green. And then if you modify 4, you multiply it by 4, you get 16, you have a different shade of green. And so you're painting with math, right? So, these are these exotic kind of unusual manifestations that people can have, relationships with math that people can have that can arise from modifying the brain, but there's no way to do that in a controlled way.
I see. Yeah, that was interesting. You think I can ask one last question before I close?
Sure.
Let me see if I remember. So I don't know if you heard of Elon Musk Neuralink.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a good idea for the future? And also, has there been any new discoveries we made for the brain in general?
So I'll take it in reverse if you don't mind. So every single day there are discoveries about the brain. Every single day. Neuroscience is one of the most rapidly advancing fields in science. Some people say we're living in a golden era, a golden age of neuroscience, because there's so many new tools that enable us to ask so many new questions that have never been able to been asked in the past. Okay, so yeah, we could talk about any of a variety. So for example, it was recently shown, again, confirmed that folks who are at risk of Alzheimer's disease, if they do 30 minutes of moderate exercise 5 days a week, they have a significantly lower risk of Alzheimer's disease. New discovery, and it's not new, it's confirmed discovery in neuroscience. 65 new genes associated with autism have been identified just in the past week. So yeah, bunch of new discoveries. Okay, so now when it comes to Elon Musk and Neuralink, I always like to say, I have a podcast, it's called Wired to be Weird, and we talked about Neuralink and more broadly computer-brain interfaces. So, to go deeper, I welcome you to check that out. But do I think it's a good idea? Absolutely. I think pretty much at this point, there are just as many people, at least in neuroscience, who anticipate that we will have a general artificial intelligence, computer-based intelligence, that will be able to surpass human intelligence. We don't know when. Yeah, we won't necessarily know when it happens. It's hard to predict when that'll happen. But the only way that the human consciousness could remain relevant is if we exploit the power and the advantages available to a computer-based system. And that doesn't, as with any new technology, same, like social media, the internet, automobiles, right? All of a sudden people were dying because they were getting in car accidents back in the day. There was a disadvantage there, but the advantages were so significant. I think it's a similar kind of thing when it comes to whole brain computer interfaces. There are going to be, disadvantages that we're going to have to try and anticipate and try and correct for, but the advantages are going to be so significant that fundamentally I think it's a good thing.
Wow. All right. Thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks for calling in, Jeff.
Definitely. You're welcome, man.
Take it easy.
All right.
My dad is from, I guess not the Boston area. He's from Lowell, Massachusetts. Elon Musk should stop watching Netflix. Well, there are some, you can criticize Elon Musk for a lot of things, okay? But the way he handles artificial intelligence, I think, is pretty pragmatically. And, when we talk about, like, it sounds ridiculous, right? It sounds like complete and utter science fiction, the idea that we would integrate computers into our brain, enable us to communicate via these computer systems, and so on. But it's not like it's just him in a wizard tower coming up with these technologies. He has a whole board of advisors, many of whom are neuroscientists and neuroengineers who are very well respected in their fields. Like, this is not like, the Boring Company, where, it's just sort of seemed like a thing that he decided to try and do, and, how viable is it in every different, municipality and so on. It's like, he met a bunch of neuroengineers and neuroscientists, and they are coming up with a private effort to make this come to fruition. So yeah. Ray Kurzweil predicted a lot of these things. Yeah, he did. Kurzweil, well, yeah. All right. There is no penultimate research I'm aware of that rules out nature versus nurture in psychology. Well, certainly in neuroscience, I mean, there's definitely no study of nature versus nurture. It's all different examples that fall into that, or different avenues of research that fall into that. But broadly, generally speaking, these days in neuroscience, you will always hear about the gene-environment interaction. It's not like the question is generally ever nature or nurture. Excluding the rare cases of, like, Rett syndrome, where it's a monogenic condition that is, that we can identify, and you will inevitably develop Rett syndrome if you have this mutation. There are very, very few examples like that. But most things that are meaningful to people who, your average person, are going to be some combination of nature and nurture. Fanarona, if your discipline is psychology, I hope you don't. I hope you're not under the assumption that I feel that psychology is less than neuroscience, or that it is not an insightful and important field. I think it's absolutely insightful and important. Just a different domain of research. And, we have a close relationship with psychologists at the University of Pennsylvania. We help inform each other's research. So I hope that I'm not coming across as adversarial based on discipline, because that would certainly not be accurate in describing my perception of the field. Okay. Can we raise a case against him? Oh, my sister had hydrocephalus, and the surgeon did a wrong surgery for her that caused disability. For hydrocephaly, could you raise a case? This is a question really for a lawyer, for a physician malpractice lawyer. I have no experience with that, but I would certainly urge you to bring it up with a physician, a malpractice, a lawyer. Are you an advocate for pharmaceuticals over natural herbs? Slap out Texas. No. No, and yes. I mean, pharmaceuticals refer to, like, a family of molecules that many of which have been purified from herbs, but they are not mutually exclusive. In fact, there are positions in many pharmaceutical companies that are devoted to scouring the globe of its herbs and finding new opportunities to treat maladies. Metformin, for example, as I said earlier on, is derived from what used to just be an herb, the French lilac, which used to be used to treat excessive urination, a hallmark symptom of diabetes. And now it was then, it was a precursor was extracted and then manipulated to generate metformin. The only difference is in quality control, really. Quality control and purity. And so, I would certainly prefer to, if I was in very, very severe pain, and an opioid might be helpful, I would certainly prefer somebody give me morphine or hydrocodone than an opium poppy pod, So, that this perceived tension between natural treatments versus pharmaceutical treatments or clinical treatments, that adversarial relationship doesn't really exist in medicine. In medicine, it's just, does the thing work? Is it the most effective strategy? If it is, then a physician will be predisposed to electing that treatment or prescribing that treatment. And so, this is speaking as a discipline as a whole, right? Of course, there's always bad doctors, there's always bad actors in the biomedical system broadly, but yeah, that is a misconception that there is like just some complete utter difference between natural remedies and clinical remedies or pharmaceutical remedies. And by the way, if something is natural, that does not mean that it's good for you or better for you. There are plenty of things in nature that are very bad for you, worth avoiding at all costs. So, yeah. Oh, sorry, I missed a topic there. All right. Where could I purchase a working human brain? A working one? That is illegal in most parts of the world because it would have to be attached to a human. And we are very fortunate to have progressed to an era where that is deemed as disgusting and grotesque as it was. As it is. Topic. Anything you'd like. WAV runner. Okay, what causes blackouts? So when you say blackouts for and Zito, generally speaking, when people talk about blackouts, they're usually referring to alcohol-induced blackouts, like I'm blackout drunk. And the thing that induces it... So, and people, interestingly, it might be regional, have different definitions of what being blacked out is. Like, I remember in Miami, people would talk about being blackout drunk as like you're passed out, like you're literally unconscious. But in most of the country, I guess, it refers to when you've had so much to drink that you're still awake and behaving, but you're no longer forming memory, and your decision making is so inebriated that you're very, very reckless, or you're uncharacteristically reckless. And so why does that happen? So alcohol is a very odd and unique drug in that it's very pharmacologically diverse. It doesn't, if you're to compare it to, let's say, nicotine in cigarette, tobacco or cigars or hookah, whatever you consume, e-cigs these days, it binds the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. It binds a couple other receptors, but that's its main target. And that's why it has any effects. Alcohol doesn't bind a specific receptor. It modifies all kinds of signaling all throughout the brain. But the sort of the broad, the general effect of alcohol is inhibitory. So people will tend to, the neurons will tend to be less active. Not universally throughout the entire brain, but generally speaking, neurons will become less active. And as a result, things like memory, things like impulse control, all of a sudden, I, for example, find lobster with butter to be the best food you can eat. It is also pretty unhealthy to just eat like a bunch of melted butter. Or, I really like gelato. There used to be a great gelato place in Philly. It's not prudent to just eat a bunch of gelato all the time. And so I have impulse control. I inhibit that impulse, that urge to satisfy that primal, appetite, that primal pleasure. But when under the influence of alcohol, what can happen is that capacity, in part derived from the prefrontal cortex, inhibiting those primal urges, is inhibited by the effect of the drug. Just look it up. ETOH stems GABA. It's one of the major reasons you can't combo with bens. So I can tell you about okay, so alcohol, yes, it doesn't bind the GABA receptor like benzodiazepines do, though. It also binds NMDA receptors. It binds serotonin receptors. It binds mu-opioid receptors. And in fact, if you were to antagonize the mu-opioid receptor while enabling somebody to consume alcohol at their pleasure, they will stop consuming it. It'll stop being rewarding. It binds a huge swath of receptor systems. And just as I would respect your expertise in psychology, this is my expertise in neuroscience. And so, believe me when I say this is a pharmacologically promiscuous drug. It doesn't have a receptor that it binds. It even alters membrane fluidity of neurons. It changes just how fluid the surface of neurons is. It changes the concentration of the fluid that fills the vestibular organs, right? The semicircular canal and the otolith organs. That's part of the reason for why you get a little bit dizzy when under the influence of alcohol. It changes the salt concentration. Right. Okay, so blackout drunk. So But a part of that pharmacological effect is inhibiting the activity of neurons that would otherwise be behaving in a different way. And as a result, you get inhibited impulse control. So you will begin to engage in riskier behavior, or behavior that you otherwise wouldn't engage in, riskier sexual behavior, riskier, or just, unhealthy, indulgent behavior. And then also you'll have more difficulty forming memory, because memory arises from the collaboration of a bunch of different brain regions, taking in sensory information, sights, sounds, and all of these sensory systems, and then forming a sort of compression file, and generating a memory of that experience. And so alcohol will inhibit that interaction between those neuronal systems. Oh, you're a med student. Okay, no, it does not bind all those. It's downstream upregulation effects, isn't it? No disrespect. No. It directly interacts with those receptors. Internal medicine, for anybody that's not familiar, that is like the coolest kind of medicine to go into. That is a person that has to identify the problem no matter what the problem is. So good luck with the rest of med school. That is no small achievement. But believe me when I say, as much time as you're spending on diagnostics, I'm spending on pharmacology. All right. Okay, I should probably call it a day. It's already 6. And so I have a podcast. It's called Wired to be Weird, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify. I have a Twitter. It's the same as my Periscope handle, _anthropoid. In residency now. Oh, very cool. That's awesome. Congrats. So yeah, I have a podcast. It's called Wired to be Weird. It's on iTunes and Stitcher. I have a Patreon. I know not everybody is in a position to be able to, have the disposable income to support this kind of activity. But if you are, I have a Patreon. It's called patreon.com/anthropoid. And if you're in a position to be able to support me at a given level, I'm happy to talk to you about any topic that you would like to just chew over with me, and I'll do my best to review the literature as best as I can, so I can actually contribute to the conversation substantively. So that's patreon.com/anthropoid. Otherwise, I will see you sometime this week. I might have to miss next Sunday, but sometime this week. And until then, have a great rest of your Sunday and a great beginning of your week. See you later, guys. And the awkward point where I have not yet turned off YouTube. So I'll see you later, YouTube.